Thank you all for coming. So I'm here to talk to Dr. Marty Klein, who has been a licensed marriage and family therapist and certified sex therapist for 3 decades. He's the award-winning author of 7 books about sexuality, including America's War on Sex, Sexual Intelligence, and the forthcoming His Porn, Her Pain. That's not a BDSM theme, is it, Mark? Okay. He's an internationally known expert on pornography and testifies on the subject in state, federal, and international courts. So good to talk to you today. So here are a few things that are widely held beliefs today about pornography. It leads to porn addiction. It is cheating and ruins marriages. It distorts young men's understanding of sex. It leads to rape and other sexually violent behavior. It degrades and humiliates women and exploits the actresses who make it. Adult porn is a gateway to watching child pornography. It causes impotence, which is kind of counter to what you'd think. It is a public health, or maybe pubic health, menace. You say every one of those assertions is false. We are in the grip of a porn panic, and so take it away. Knock down these myths and tell us why they're wrong.
Well, hello, everybody. Just your typical lunchtime conversation. You might want to turn the ringer down on your smartphone if you have one. Let's start with the porn panic. I know that you're familiar with the concept of moral panics, and many of you are too. A moral panic is when a culture or a society is gripped by, say, a fever where there's a perceived problem. The degree of the problem is magnified beyond logic, and people are mobilizing. People demand that the authorities in the culture mobilize, and people believe things that when we're not in the grip of a moral panic, they might not believe.
Satanic ritual abuse.
Satanic ritual abuse in the 1980s, where people actually believed things that couldn't physically be true. And we've seen a number of moral panics. Actually, you're not old enough, but in the 1950s, there was a moral panic about comic books.
Old enough.
Where there were actually public burnings of comic books because people believed that comic books were responsible for a lot of terrible things. So I look out the window and I think, gee, we're in the middle of a porn panic, a moral panic about pornography, where people are throwing around beliefs that are not borne out by the science, and people are frightened about stuff that we want to be sympathetic about, but if they just talked about it in a reasonable way, maybe a lot of that fear would go away. So in the context of porn panic, it's understandable that people would believe some of these things. Fortunately, we have data on almost all these things, and we could actually check some knowable facts, and we could find out exactly what's going on.
Okay, so why is this all wrong? You say porn is not addictive. You say it's not exploitative of women. You say porn use in and of itself is not damaging to marriages. So what are the facts that counter those beliefs? And they're very widely held. Let me just say, when I was preparing for this, I saw a story in the Huffington Post that said Brock Turner, the former Stanford student who was recently convicted of sexual assault, it said he is an avatar of porn culture. He did what he did because pornography is poisoning young American minds.
Well, who could argue with something as vague as that? What he did was awful, and I don't think we need to discuss Brock Turner.
No,
we have so much, but you're right. Porn culture is another one of those expressions that gets tossed around. I think if you want to talk about porn culture, maybe we should talk about internet culture, which is really, I think, more salient. But let's start with how porn affects marriages, or we might say relationships. because there's as a therapist, I see 20 patients a week. I've done that for the last 35 years. I'm on my second comfortable leather chair now. Apparently, I get 20,000 hours per chair. Every single week, I see couples or individuals who are distressed about the issue of pornography one way or another. And it's very upsetting for people, and frankly, it's upsetting for me. And I think the number one myth that I wanna challenge is the idea that two people, I'm motioning to us like we're a couple here, these two people over here, Emily, the idea that two people could have a nourishing and enjoyable and pleasant sexual relationship, and that somehow porn would sneak into the house in the middle of the night, grab the guy around the neck, and drag him away from this fabulous sexual relationship that he's having with this enjoyable partner, and suddenly lose interest in his partner. That flies in the face of everything we know about human beings. And fortunately, it's not true. People don't leave fabulous sexual relationships so that they can masturbate to pictures of pretty naked women. That doesn't make any sense. Here's what does happen. People are in sexual relationships that are not satisfying, and simultaneously, they masturbate to pornography, and they enjoy that. And they don't get any more interested in their partner because they already have tried sex with their partner, and they find it not so enjoyable. What goes on a lot in American households is not a lot of sex with a lot of long-term couples, or the sex becomes perfunctory. This is how I make a living talking about this. If this ever gets fixed, I got to find a real job. My experience as a therapist is that when long-term couples don't have a lot of sex, or the sex that they have is perfunctory, they really don't want to talk about it. And I'm really sympathetic about that. Most people would rather chew glass than have the conversation of, you know, honey, I'll love you until the end of time, but how come we haven't had sex in the last 3 years? And that is really, really, really common. It's really, really, really common. I'm not pathologizing it. I'm just saying that's what long-term relationships are like for a lot of people. No sex or very little sex, and the sex that they have is kind of perfunctory. In that context, rather than talk about that, it's a lot easier for people to argue about porn. It's a lot easier for both partners to argue. You shouldn't look at porn. No, it's okay. Porn is crap. No, it's not. Porn makes people go out and rape people. I don't rape anybody. It's a lot easier for couples to have that conversation than, listen, how come we hardly ever have sex anymore, even though we both know that we both love each other?
When I was Dear Prudence, I would get, not infrequently, letters from younger women who said, I thought we were having a great sex life, and then my husband said he was going up to work on refinancing the house, and I walked in, he wasn't looking at home refinancing sites. What happened? You know, I thought everything was great. Why is he looking at this? I feel he's cheating on me.
Well, let's use our words, because when she went up to see if he was getting a really good rate, which if you live in California is the ultimate orgasm. When she walked up there, she saw two things, one of which was that he was looking at pictures of naked women on the screen, but he was doing something else too. He was masturbating. And in my opinion, before we talk about pornography, we need to make sure that everybody's okay about masturbation. Not talking about masturbation and just talking about porn, that's like saying to your husband or your wife, I don't want you watching The Daily Show, it's crap. And if that person, and if I said to the person, well, how do you feel about television in general? And if the person says, well, I think all television is terrible and it rots your brain and nobody should watch television, well, then we don't need to discuss the merits of The Daily Show, right? The issue is you don't like television. So there are lots of couples, and in fact, I'm stunned at the number of college women who feel this way. If my partner loves me, they shouldn't masturbate. Or if my partner is sexually satisfied with me, there's no reason for them to masturbate. And if my partner wants a sexual experience, rather than using their right hand, they should come and talk to me about it. Now, if that's somebody's perspective, we don't need to talk about pornography at that point. We need to talk about issues of autonomy within relationships, and we need to talk about what's the contract. I dare say that most people who are, how many people here are legally married to somebody or other? Right. How many people when you made, keep your hands up, how many people when you made your vow mentioned pornography one way or another? Right, okay, so we have one person in the front. And he's actually married to a goat, which is interesting. So this woman writes into Dear Prudence, and let's fill in the, let's fill in the letter. Dear Prudence, my husband was getting us a great rate. I go upstairs. I find that he's having sex with Mary Five Fingers. He's looking at porn. He's masturbating. I felt left out, and I felt betrayed. And what's up with that? So feeling left out, is understandable. Feeling betrayed, as if there were an agreement that he had broken. Now, as a couples therapist, how many people here are psychologists of some sort of? Yeah, so you see couples, right? Don't you find it interesting how many people in couples are trying to patrol agreements that don't exist, right? Like, you'll have somebody saying, how come what do I have to do to get you to not drop your socks in the living room floor? You're always dropping your dirty socks on the living room floor. And the other person may say, oh, I'm sorry. Oh, I forgot. Oh, I was tired. But the other person never agreed that they were going to put their dirty socks in the laundry. So until there's an agreement one way or the other, these two people are going to quarrel about this until the end of time. So,
oh, God, don't tell me that. Okay.
You got to sit your partner down. First, get a great rate on a new mortgage. Yeah. So if people in couples are uncomfortable with their partner masturbating, of course they're going to be uncomfortable with their partner masturbating to porn. They'll be uncomfortable with their partner masturbating to a golf tournament, which does happen. So we can make a lot of jokes about the size of people's putters and all that, but so what I want to know when people are complaining about their partner masturbating to porn, step one is, how do you feel about your partner masturbating? If they say that's really not okay, then that's the conversation that I want to have.
Okay. Let's talk about kids a little bit, which is really a serious part of the panic. At breakfast this morning, I was talking to a couple who has a 12-year-old and 9-year-olds, and they knew I was coming here to talk to you, and they said, all right, how do we keep our kids from stumbling upon this, from seeking it out? Isn't it going to poison their mind when young children see these very vivid images? Isn't it going to get fixed in their minds? This is this is truly something terrible, and how do we protect our children's innocence?
You would think that those two questions would go in the opposite order. Step one is not how do you keep your kids from stumbling on porn. Step one is, what is it that you would be trying to accomplish by keeping your kid away from porn? What exactly is it that you're afraid of? If you want your kid, if the reason you don't want your kid to look at porn, by the way, I don't think 9-year-olds should be looking at porn. If I could make it possible that 9-year-olds would not be looking at porn, I would do it in a heartbeat. That said,
what's the age?
36, 37. I mean, at what age do we want our kids to start being sexual? 36, 37. So if parents are genuinely concerned about the ideas that kids are going to get from porn, then I would expect that they would be pursuing that goal in a number of ways. And preventing them from watching porn would only be one of those ways. If you don't want your kids to get bad ideas about sex, there's a lot of other things you need to be doing besides keeping them away from porn. You need to be talking to them about TV commercials. You need to be talking to them about if they use the word big fat butt when they're in the supermarket pointing to some lady over there. If you want your kids to have good ideas about sex, you need to be talking to your kids about good ideas about sex. What is this? What is sex for? Why do people have sex? How do you decide when it's time to have sex? 9 years old is not in any way too early to have that conversation. So when parents are worried about how do they keep their kids away from porn, again, I'm very sympathetic about that. And we can talk about some strategies about that. But sooner or later, our kids are going to look at porn. Generally not because they stumble on it, but sooner or later because they're curious and they want to know about it. But sooner or later, most of our kids are going to look at porn. And the question is, on the day that they look at porn the first time, how many conversations will they have had with their parents about sexuality? Not just about porn, but about sexuality and about porn. So the very first day that they look at porn, whether they're 8 or 18, the very first day that they look at porn, they're going to be equipped to actually process what they're looking at, rather than, oh, now that you've looked at porn, now I have to rev up this machine about what do we do about it.
Obviously, people have always looked at whatever was available. As a kid, my siblings and I discovered my grandfather's stash of Playboy, and we're playing Fort, leave us alone, Nana, and we would look at it. It seems so benign, though, compared to what's available. Here's part of the panic and the fear. My kids are going to be seeing grossly horrible things, violence against women, etc., and get an idea that this is what sex is like. Obviously, what we saw in Playboy is not necessarily what normal sex is like, what real people look like.
Right.
But this is the technology provides a whole different dimension.
Right. Now, let me break that into 1.5 questions, because how many people, we're old friends now, and now, Emily and I are now talking about our deepest, darkest childhood experiences. How many people stumbled on some sort of sexually explicit material when they were under the age of 18? Raise your hand. Okay, so that's about 3/4 of the audience, okay? So this is a normative experience. And while it's absolutely true that a Playboy centerfold is in many ways different than much pornography, on the other hand, stumbling on a sexually explicit image when you're 11 years old is stumbling on a sexually explicit image when you're 11 years old. Whether it's a pretty naked lady or whether it's 4 pretty naked ladies having sex with each other on Mars. So I wouldn't so quickly say that we have a new problem now that we didn't have then. I'd say we have an additional problem now that we didn't have then. When I stumbled on, it wasn't Playboy, it was a deck of playing cards. When I stumbled on a deck of playing cards when I was a kid, I was completely unprepared for that. And because we lived in an apartment building in Brooklyn, I couldn't say we were building a fort. So that was in some ways, that was the exact same experience. There was my life up until the day before I saw that deck of playing cards, and then there was my life after I saw that deck of playing cards. So let's not just casually dismiss, well, in the old days it was just Playboy. Now, let's talk about being afraid that our kids are looking at the most horrible, gruesome crap in the history of the universe. We actually know what's in pornography. We know the content of porn. If you listen to Helen Fisher's talk yesterday, she's with Match.com. How many people heard Helen's talk? Yeah, a few. So Helen does research with Match.com, and she said, if you're on Match.com, we know all about you. We know how many times a day you go on Match.com. We know how many minutes each time you're there. We know how many times you do this, how much you do that. Well, the porn companies, they know what you're looking at, and they know what they publish. And these are knowable facts. We don't have to speculate. Now, the truth is, there's a tiny, 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 tiny little sliver. Did I say tiny? There's a tiny, tiny little sliver of incredibly gruesome stuff that almost anybody can access on pornography. Interestingly enough, there's not a whole lot of people who access that stuff. The overwhelming majority of porn in the United States that's commercially available depicts people doing the kinds of stuff that you were doing when you were in love. Before you were married for 29 years? I mean, that's just a knowable fact. That's just a knowable fact. Most porn depicts people with smiles on their faces. Most porn depicts people who are enjoying what they're doing. And there are some people who don't much care for that, and that's okay with me. But for people For people who are concerned about violence against women, which I certainly am, and have spent most of my career, working on reducing. For people who are concerned about violence against women, for people who are concerned about people getting bad ideas about sex from whatever the medium is, I would think that people would be glad to know that the overwhelming majority of porn is not gruesome, horrible, let's slice women in half and ejaculate on each half of their bodies. Most porn's just not like that. And there is porn like that, and there are some people who enjoy looking at that stuff. How somebody can get an erection while looking at that, that's an interesting question. The good news is that most porn isn't like that, and most people don't look at the porn that is like that. Good news.
You talk eloquently in the book about...
Thank you, Emily.
Period, we're done. No. Erotic fantasies, and how the importance of them, and how there's kind of a popular confusion, especially vis-a-vis porn, between things you might want to enjoy looking at that are stimulating to look at, and things you actually want to do in life.
Right.
And you kind of say porn is now a catalog of every possible erotic fantasy. You can just sort of type in search words and see things. Can you talk about the pluses and minuses of that, or the fears people have about exposing people to disturbing things, or the plus of discovering, erotic ideas you didn't know, or being stimulated by erotic images, and maybe that's helpful to one's sex life to see things that are arousing?
Well, to start with the end of your question first, I don't spend a lot of time talking about how great porn is. I don't recommend to my patients that they watch porn, and if they ask me for a recommendation of a particular porn site, I don't give them one. The countertransference possibilities, or the transference possibilities, are just gigantic. I was actually in a sex ed film a few years ago, and a couple came in and they said, we were in bed naked watching the sex ed film, and you came on. And I thought that must be just the creepiest thing in the whole world. It was not a porn film. I haven't gotten a whole lot of offers to be in a porn film. But what was the question? Oh, about
the erotic.
Right. So I don't spend a lot of time talking about the erotic possibilities that people can gain from looking at porn. I'm more interested in helping people feel less terrified, and I'm interested in helping people support public policy legislation and interpersonal regulation that's more humane and supports people. So if you think that it's normal for people to have sexual fantasies, and that's a pretty well-established fact, that it's pretty it's certainly normative, right? Almost everybody, I wouldn't say everybody, almost everybody has sexual fantasies. Then the question, just like almost everybody has fantasies about what they would do if they won the lottery. I mean, how many people in this room have never thought, now maybe if you've already got $100 million, you don't fantasize about money, in which case we don't want...
This room is more likely than most rooms.
True enough,
okay.
True enough. So other than you people who are worth $100 million and you know who you are, I mean, how many people have never had a fantasy about what I would do if I had so much money I could do whatever I wanted to do? Now, everybody's had that fantasy. If I had so much money I could do whatever I want to do. If you tallied those fantasies, if you had a big enough bucket to tally the fantasies on what I would do if I had an unlimited amount of money, first of all, the variety would be extraordinary. And second of all, some of those things we would think, geez, I never even thought of that. And some of those things we would think to ourselves, that's the sickest thing I ever heard. You would do what if you had that? So the exact same thing is true with pornography. Pornography is a catalog or a library or a bucket or a documentation of the entire range of human sexual fantasies. And in case you haven't heard, we are a strange bunch of creatures. And there are people who have sexual fantasies that wouldn't be arousing to you, maybe wouldn't be arousing to me. And some people have sexual fantasies, and we think, if you have that sexual fantasy, I'm not so sure I want to use your kitchen. right? So if you look at pornography as here's a big pile of sexual fantasies that people have, we look at that big pile and we say, geez, is that the family that I'm part of? Wow. Then the question is, what's the relationship between people's fantasies and people's desires? And if you put the question of sex aside for a second, we know that in most arenas of life, fantasy has very little predictive value about desire. Most of us have had fantasies about quitting our jobs and moving to Tahiti. Most of us don't actually want to do that. And most of us, if we had the option of doing that, most of us wouldn't do it anyway. So pornography is like that, and sexual fantasy in general. Forget about pornography. I mean, if you have your average couple and she's imagining being sexual with George Clooney, or she's imagining being sexual with her boyfriend's brother, or whatever it is, most people, their sexual fantasies don't predict their actual desire. Fantasy is a lot of fun to think about, but typically, and this is a fact, I mean, this is not just my opinion, typically, people's fantasies don't predict their desires. So the good news is that if you look at the most extreme end of pornography and you see what those fantasies are, they don't predict desire in much of the people who look at those, who enjoy those fantasies.
The ugly, violent part.
The ugly, violent ones, yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And in general, I mean, here's a really common sexual fantasy that a lot of heterosexual men have. Having sex with two heterosexual women. Really common sexual fantasy. This is one I am not going to ask you to raise your hand on, by the way. It's a really common sexual fantasy. If you ask men, well, would you actually want to have sex with your regular partner and another woman, the number of people who want to do that drops way down from the fantasy. Yeah, he may be an exception, but the number of people who actually want to do that drops way down. And the number of people who, when presented with that opportunity, who actually say yes, it's even lower than that. So that's how porn is in general, not just and sexual fantasy in general, not just porn.
You say there is no such thing as porn addiction. In addition, you say there's no such thing as sex addiction.
Right.
Okay. Your book discusses how neither appears in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. Right. Which,
not that I think that means anything.
Right.
But it's a good thing to toss out.
Right. But it's such a widely held belief. I even, as dear Prudence, got letters from men who said, I'm a
sex addict.
Yeah, I'm a sex addict, I'm a porn addict.
Sure.
Okay, so why don't you believe that exists?
Well, interestingly enough, those guys who wrote to you and said, say 3 years ago, I'm a porn addict, or I'm a sex addict, 35 years ago or 45 years ago, if they had been writing to you when you were 5 years old, they wouldn't have described themselves that way. You know, just diagnostic labels come and go out of fashion. Nymphomaniac, you know, in our lifetime, not only was that in the DSM, but that was something that people talked about seriously.
Yeah.
Now we know a nymphomaniac, that's a woman who wants sex one more time than her partner does, right? So, and a sex addict, that's a person who wants sex one more time than somebody thinks is appropriate. So I'm being asked, you know, these days. Now, I was the first American writer to challenge the concept of sex addiction back in 1985 when Patrick Carnes, by the way, the guy who invented sex addiction will tell you, if you ever ask him, that he is not a sex expert, he's an addiction expert. The guy who invented sex addiction is an addictionologist, not a sex therapist, not even a sex expert. And interestingly enough, the sex addiction movement has allowed the public to believe that sex addiction comes out of the sex therapy community. It doesn't, it didn't, and still very few people in the sex therapy field believe in sex addiction. Okay, that said, I don't think it's entirely intellectually fair for me to have to prove that there's no such thing as porn addiction. I think it's up to the people who believe in porn addiction to believe that there's such a thing as porn addiction. That said, I'll pick up the challenge anyway. And And I think it really turns on your definition of addiction. If you believe that I'm addicted to chocolate chip cookies, then I'll believe that you're addicted to pornography. But I think I just like chocolate chip cookies more than is good for me. And I think that my decision making around, now that we're old friends, I can admit this, my decision, and they have some out there, my decision making around chocolate chip cookies is not terribly healthy. I'm sorry, it's true. And I believe, and I have met face to face, people whose decision making around pornography is not healthy. It's either hurting them or hurting their relationship. So I believe that there are people who have trouble with pornography, but the idea that that there's something about pornography that if you consume enough of it, that there's a change in your metabolism, there's a change in your ability to metabolize the substance, in this case pornography, that, let me see if I can find the perfect word, that idea is silly. And the so-called neuroscience on that is complete, what's the word, junk science. The neuroscience studies are perfectly sound, but if you ask the people doing the studies, does this prove the existence of porn addiction, they all say no. It's the popularizers of the porn addiction movement who are cherry-picking those studies and saying, now here's what those studies prove. Now, most of us are not trained in reading MRIs. And so when someone says, here's what MRIs say, that the part of the brain that lights up when you use heroin also lights up when you use pornography.
Also when you eat chocolate chip cookies.
And also when you cuddle your grandchildren. Mm-hmm. So, so the idea that popularizers are taking these studies and interpreting them in a way that nobody who can't read an MRI can refute, that's a free pass for those people.
Your book explicitly does not deal with child pornography.
The new one.
The new one.
Yeah.
His porn, her pain.
Yeah.
You say that's a separate issue. It's illegal.
Right.
I didn't realize this. You said if you're looking for child pornography on the web, you're not just going to accidentally stumble on it.
Correct.
You really got to look at it.
Yeah.
Okay, so you say that's just beyond the purview of what you're doing. A lot of people would say child pornography is at the center of this whole problem and this whole porn culture that's exploded since 2000 when it became widely available on the web. Is creating monstrous films, and creating criminals who consume it.
Right.
So don't you have to deal with it? How can you just say, I'm not dealing with child pornography?
Well, it's unfortunate that I have to say this, but I have to start by saying I'm against child porn. And the fact that I have to say to a group of thinking people that I'm against child porn, I think, sort of reveals that we're in the grip of a panic already about this. Be that as it may. So I want to go on record, very controversial statement, I'm against child porn, right? So imagine that you own a pornography company. It could happen. Imagine that you own a pornography company, an adult pornography company. What you do for a living is your company makes adult pornography. You are making money faster than you can count it. You got to keep hiring more and more people to count the money that you're making by manufacturing and distributing adult pornography. And you belong to the best country clubs in town. You come to the Aspen Institute. There's nothing wrong with what you're doing. You're selling a legal product and you're making a fortune and you're gonna live happily ever after. Now imagine your board of directors. You sit around one day and somebody comes on the board of directors comes up with an idea and says, listen, I got a great idea. We're now manufacturing a legal product and distributing it to about 60, 70 million people every month in the United States. And most of the users pretty happy with the product. I got an idea. Let's start manufacturing a product that is illegal, that everybody agrees is like the worst thing you can possibly do, that if we go to jail, every murderer and thug and rapist in jail will go after us because we are below murderers and rapists in jail. Let's do that. Now you're the head of the company. What would you say to that idea? You would say, I don't think that's such a good idea. And indeed, adult porn companies don't manufacture child porn. So people who say that, that the adult porn companies are trying to addict people to child porn, it's a silly idea and it's not true. I'm very sympathetic about people who are afraid about that. Do people go from looking at adult porn to looking at child porn? Well, there's a certain number of people in society who look at child porn, and it turns out it's difficult to predict who those people are going to be. Some percentage of those people do look at adult porn because such a big percentage of people look at adult porn. But by and large, the audiences for those two products are very, very different. And people who look at child porn are not interested in looking at naked 27-year-olds. People who look into child porn are interested in looking at child porn. So the market for those two products is different, and I don't think that there's any evidence at all that people who look at adult porn, they think, oh, I have an idea. Why don't I start looking at 8-year-olds, being sexual? It just doesn't make any sense, and the good news is it doesn't happen.
Okay. To talk more about young people, as a result of this panic, we have laws that say if you're 17 and you take a naked picture of yourself, you are breaking the law. You could be possessing child pornography. If you send it to your boyfriend, you are distributing child pornography, and there are kids who've gotten caught up in these prosecutions.
Right.
So talk about sexting. Are our laws crazy and crazily punitive? And how do we begin to push back on that? Because it doesn't seem as if there's a wide audience of people who want to stand up and say, no, that's fine.
Because then we get accused of being in favor of child pornography, which, have I mentioned, I'm not in favor of it? So let's start with the most fundamental fact. In the United States, no matter where you live, no matter who you are, in the United States, you are not allowed to document any aspect of the sexuality of minors. You're not allowed to document anything having to do with childhood sexuality.
Even if you're that minor.
Even if you're that minor, but if you're the minor's parent, you're not allowed to take a picture of your 6-year-old naked playing Monopoly, because that can be interpreted as you creating a lascivious document of childhood sexuality.
I thought the laws kind of made a distinction between cute naked bathtub photos, saying there has to be some intent.
No. Now, basically, it comes down to what any 12 people on a jury are going to say. You can claim, look, it's just a bathtub photo, it's a bearskin rug photo, to use an old-fashioned expression. Look, it's my 6-year-old, planting tomato seeds. If a zealous DA goes after you, it's up to the 12 people on the jury to decide. And what the jury instructions will be is this a photo that somebody can perceive as lascivious? Well, people can perceive anything as lascivious. So it starts with, we as a society have made the decision that we're not allowed to document the sexuality of minors. Now, from there, we go to minors are not allowed to document their own sexuality. And most minors don't know that. And if you tell them that to their face, they don't believe it. They don't understand it. If you tell the average 15-year-old about the age of consent laws, they say, well, yeah, sure, whatever. And then you say, actually, there's a kid in jail down the road from here because of this and that. They just look at you in disbelief. So, and it's understandable, because minors' lived experience is that they have all this autonomy. And the idea that they can decide what clothes they're going to put on their body, and decide whether or not they're going to shave their pubic hair, and decide whether or not they're going to get a tattoo, and decide whether or not they're going to get their ears pierced, and decide whether or not they're going to kiss whoever they're going to kiss, but they don't have the right to take a naked photograph of themselves, it just boggles their mind. And you could understand that. So the really mind-boggling thing is that the age at which a picture of someone can be considered child pornography is fixed. It's 18. It's not upper or lower depending on where you live. Any depiction of a person under the age of 18, a sexual depiction, that is eligible to be considered child porn. However, there are half of the states in the United States have an age of consent 17 or lower. So in Nebraska, for example, a 17-year-old has the right to have sex with another 17-year-old, but they don't have the right to take a photograph of themselves having sex with another 17-year-old. And you can understand that's kind of confusing. So I'm all in favor of laws, that actually protect young people, and there's a lot of protecting that needs to be done. But a law that simultaneously points to someone and says you are both the perpetrator and the victim at the very same time, clearly that makes no sense. There are a couple of states that are scaling these laws back from felonies to misdemeanors, but again, that's not a perfect solution because it still criminalizes.
Well, some of these kids can end up on the sex offender registry for life,
right.
And your life is
ruined.
Essentially ruined.
25% of the registered sex offenders in California are minors. Not all for sexting. Some for public urination, some for unwanted kissing. But 25% of the registered sex offenders in California are minors. That's staggering. Yeah. And there are kids all over the country now who are taking enormous chances. And when adults say to kids, you shouldn't do this because it's bad for you, I mean, what do kids usually say? Yeah, whatever, right? I don't remember what we said before the word whatever had been invented, but I know it was the right attitude. It was, yeah, ma, sure. That's probably what I said. But these, so people say, oh, if you sexed, it could endanger your chances of getting a job, as Secretary of Agriculture. And kids say, yeah, whatever. Or if you sexed, somebody who might want to marry you might see that picture and they might not want to marry you. Yeah, whatever. Or you're encouraging pedophiles in the world. That's really, yeah, whatever for a 16-year-old. But really, the main thing that a 16-year-old has to know is, if you take a naked selfie and you share it with somebody, you could go to jail for 1,000 years. And kids will still say, yeah, whatever. But that's really the most onerous consequence. And ironically, it's the one that we have the most control over.
Yeah. There's a case in Virginia recently. It was initiated by the girl. The girl, excuse me, started sending breast photos, to her boyfriend or the guy she wanted to be her boyfriend, and said, come on, send me a dick photo. He does. The mother sees this, goes to the police. The prosecutor threatened to inject an erection drug in the boy's penis in order to see if it matched the photo. Not
because the dick photo didn't have his face.
That's right.
So how do we identify whose dick it is?
Not kidding. Fortunately, it was so outrageous and got so much attention in the Washington Post, the prosecutor had to back off. Aside from that, that could have been a young man on the sex offender
Absolutely.
registry.
Not to mention, even if he goes free, he's had his dick injected in front of the police and et cetera.
No, the whole thing is.
Yeah.
We're going to get to questions soon. You, in the book, talk about porn literacy.
Porn literacy, yeah.
And its importance. What do you mean by that?
Discuss. Well, we all know the expression media literacy, right? Where we want people who consume media to be smart consumers. We want them to understand certain things about the media that they consume. I remember way long ago, I spoke to a bunch of college students at Columbia, actually, in New York, and I had just had lunch with the woman who, at that time, was making the decision about what goes on the cover of Newsweek. That's how old the story is. Newsweek actually had a cover. So I start my talk, and my talk was about media. So I start my talk with these kids, with these students, by saying, I just had lunch with the person who decides what goes on the cover of Newsweek every week. And their mouths dropped open. They said, wait, somebody actually makes that decision? I said, well, How many people here listen to music, everybody? I said, you know, whatever goes on the album cover, you know, somebody actually makes the decision about what goes on the album cover. Somebody makes the decision about what's the lead story on the nightly news. Well, these kids had never even thought of that. So media literacy is important to teach everybody that we need to be skeptical about certain sources. For example, if you read a newspaper story and it's filled with an anonymous source says, a source who declined to be named says, etc., we want to write to the public editor and we want to say, is there a reason for this or is this just nonsense? So porn literacy is a kind of media literacy. Porn literacy is some basic information and a basic attitude that we want everybody, particularly young people, we want everybody to have when they're consuming porn. Part of the problem with minors consuming porn is if they don't have any sexual experience or if they only have limited sexual experience, when they look at the images that they see, they don't know how to decode them properly. They don't know that some adults play games in bed. Some adults play, I'm going to force you to do such and such, for example. Some people who consume porn, when they, it doesn't occur to them that, you know, the bodies in porn are very unusual. You know, like most people who watch the NBA, they know that those are unusual bodies that they're watching. Most people who watch the NFL, they know that those are unusual bodies that they're watching. People who look at porn need to know those are very unusual bodies that you're watching. That's not your average body. And just like in the NBA, when you see Steph Curry, you know, hit 80 jillion threes in a row, you know, until it really matters.
Sorry, Marty.
Yeah. But you know, when you see Steph Curry hit a gajillion threes, or you see LeBron James, you know, following somebody down the court and blocking a shot from behind, that's not the average basketball game that you're watching. That's not what you see in your local Y. Well, in porn, you see people doing stuff that people frequently don't do when they're at home. So, you know, anal sex, not that common with heterosexual people, especially not the second time. It's like sex at the beach. Well,
okay, I think we're all porn literate now.
So there are things that we want, particularly for young people, to know and to be literate consumers if they're going to look at porn, which we don't want them to do in the first place.
Okay. We're going to turn to questions. So we have someone with a microphone, right? Okay. So the rules are, I've been told, stand, speak loudly into the microphone because we're recording this. Say your name. I think you should be able to say your porn name in this context. Mine is Mittens Ward, by the way. You all know how that, your first pet and the street you grew up on. Okay, so anyway, please stand, say your name. This gentleman here.
Hi, my name is John Aaron, and I've been teaching 8th graders for 40 years. At
Oh my God.
At an
Give him a
independent
medal.
school in Baltimore, outside of Baltimore. I think we're all on the same page when we say, just because you say condom and show a young person a condom, that doesn't mean that he or she wants to have sexual intercourse, et cetera, et cetera. But the thing that is, I think, the big challenge, you've talked about boundaries. And we have a responsibility to know what the law is, teach our kids what the law is, whatever that status quo is. The big challenge, I think, are the boundaries in terms of in education, in interpersonal relationships, and in growing to understand what it means to be an independent young man and an independent young woman and the relationship. So in 1976, I'm sorry.
Okay,
okay.
You gotta
I know.
get to the 21st century and ask your question.
We've gone from sex ed to calling the course issues to now calling the course wellness,
Right.
which is a real good progression.
Right.
The challenge is, how do you address these concepts of boundaries and get the parents involved in the discussion And the thing is, how do we talk about porn without knowing what it is? And how does the school facilitate that relationship and put the young men and women in the best position to think critically and in the name of sort of respecting one another, et cetera?
That's a great question, John. And you know, schools are operating in a difficult position because they have legal restrictions on what they're allowed to say, and sometimes those legal restrictions contradict fulfilling their mission to prepare young people in the way that we would like to. So it would be nice if every school district could send a letter home and say, "Dear Mom and Dad, now that your kid is in high school, please talk to your kid about sex. We almost don't even care what it is, but please start talking to them about sex." It'd be nice if every junior high school would send a letter home with their kids and say, "Look, now that your kid is in junior high school, please talk to your kid about sex." It's an awful thing when the very first thing that parents talk to the very first time parents talk to their kids about sex, it's a conversation about porn. That's a terrible place to start the long series of conversations about sex, starting with porn is crap, don't look at it, and if I see you watching it, I'll kill you. So what can the school do? I don't think that the progression to wellness is altogether a good thing, because what happens with the progression to wellness is that in a lot of ways, sexuality has gotten lost in the shuffle. I agree with you that when it comes to talking about sexuality, we need a lot more than talking about fallopian tubes. We need a lot more than talking about the plumbing or the facts about sex. What's really needed is to contextualize conversation about sex at school in the larger issues. You know, the reason that you don't push somebody to have sex that they don't want is the identical reason that you don't steal somebody's lunch money. And the reason that you don't do that is only partly because you respect the other person. Part of the reason you don't do that is because, is that the kind of person that you want to be? Somebody who forces somebody to do stuff they don't want to do. What's up with that? What kind of person does that? So I would like to see schools talk about sex more and more frankly, and to talk about values and to talk about boundaries. I think talking about consent without talking about pleasure, talking about consent without talking about self-esteem and self-respect, talking about consent without talking about, well, what is it that you want from a relationship, is an incomplete conversation. So I would like to see schools talk about the larger dynamics of relationships and not simply talk about one slice of it, which is don't force anybody to do stuff they don't want to do. I'm totally in favor of that message. I certainly didn't get that message when I was in school. I'm totally in favor of the message, hey, dude, don't force anybody to do anything they don't want to do. Hey, young lady, don't force anybody to do anything they don't want to do. What kind of person do you want to be? But if we want to talk about sex in a way that's helpful to people, we need to context that in a bigger picture. And by the way, could we please talk about alcohol and sex?
Question over here.
Hi, my name is Glynis, and my poor name is Curly Nelson. I loved your talk. I disagreed with a lot of what you said. I'm a social worker, and I'm a parent. And I've tried to become porn literate. And in my due diligence, I have done every Google search imaginable to find what you referenced as healthy, consensual porn. So I have tried consensual porn, porn where a woman looks happy, porn where a woman is smiling, porn where a woman looks semi-conscious, porn that doesn't end always with a money shot. How do you find that porn?
Go to Pornhub.com. Go to RedTube.com.
My boy's favorite, by the way.
Go to WarriorWeb.com. I mean, it's what most people want to look at. I mean, if you had the opportunity, excuse me, Glynis, right? If you had the opportunity tonight to look through a window and to watch people having sex, would you want to watch people crying out in pain, or would you want to watch people having a good time? And yes, you must answer that question now.
But she says she can't find what you're talking about.
Well, I just told her how to find it. I mean, most people who are looking for porn are not Googling consensual porn.
I'm Stacey Cray, and I'm just going to confess that I have never seen a porno, so I don't have
Well, tonight
a porn name.
Glennis is going to...
Great, she seems like a lovely lady. So I teach teens about misuse of social media and sexual consent in the California schools. I disagree with a lot of what you said about the law, but my question is well, I have a friend who has 3 older boys who are in high school, and I said to him, you know, how are you dealing with this, all these kids all constantly online looking at porn? And he said, you know, it's interesting because what happened with my sons was that they looked at it, there's so much of it out there that they just kind of went through a phase, now they never look at it. So I'm just sort of curious about whether or not there is also this, is there a positive side to this, that you don't have to sneak around and go to the local bookstore and possibly get caught, and it's out there. And if people are really looking at what you're saying is healthy, and we're otherwise discouraging teens from doing other things like, I think the sexting stuff personally is a lot more damaging, that's a lot more personalized, and there are real victims in that, right? So I'm just curious if there is this sense that if you get so much of it, you just turn away from it and you look to real relationships and real people.
Well, I think that certainly happens with some... Did everybody hear the question? No?
Yes.
The question is, what about the saturation effect? What about a 15-year-old realizes that you can look at porn anytime you like, and they look at it all the time, and then they get bored with it? And that saturation effect definitely happens. And it happens not just with porn. Last night, there was a panel right on this very stage where people were talking about podcasting. And somebody asked, how many people don't podcast? A bunch of people raised their hand, and somebody said, why not? And one of the answers was, well, because there's so many podcasts, I just don't know where to choose, and I get paralyzed, and so I don't watch any. So it's not just with, I wish that would kick in with me with chocolate chip cookies, like, so I could stop. But yeah, that happens. It's one of the 3 or 4 most common patterns that some people do, in fact, watch a lot, and then they get tired of it. Another thing that happens is that they watch a lot, then they get a boyfriend or a girlfriend, and wow, nothing can compete with that when you're 18 years old.
Do those, I mean, we hear, but those boys aren't porn literate, so
Right.
they treat those girls as if they're all in a porn movie.
I would say you're right, except I would amend that. It's not that they just treat the girls that way. They treat the sexual encounter that way because they treat themselves the way they see porn actors, the same, just like they treat the young women the way they see.
Okay, that seems not good.
So I agree with you, and to me, that's the biggest thing as a culture that we need to be addressing, that there are a lot of young people who are looking at porn and they're getting the wrong ideas about sex. It's not that they're going to go out and rape somebody, it's that they're simply getting the wrong ideas about sex. For example, the idea that, I mean, porn leaves out most of the best parts of sex. It leaves out the kissing, it leaves out the cuddling, it leaves out the talking, it leaves out the laughing, and it leaves out the wondering whether or not you're going to have sex. So porn leaves out a lot of that. Porn gives young people the idea that once you start having sex, it's like getting on an express train, and the train doesn't stop until you get to Grand Central Station. You know, whereas in real life, healthy adults or people who create healthy adult sex, it's a local train. You know, you do a little of this, then you say, wait, I need to open the window, it's hot in here. Then you do a little of that, and you say, oh, you're leaning on my hair, ow, 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 ow. Then you do a little of this, and somebody says, I have to pee, please don't finish before I get back. So that's what real life sex is like. You don't see that in porn. What you see in porn is that 2 people who barely know each other do a bunch of stuff without talking about it, and then at the end, they say goodbye, and they don't have any relationship after that. That's the wrong model of sexuality, and that needs to be changed. And the only way to change that is for parents to sit down with kids when they're 6, 8, 10, 12 years old and talk about sexuality in general and what the best parts of sex are all about and why you should go through all of the trouble to have sex. And then when kids see an alternative model in porn when they're 14 years old, then they have something to compare it to and say, that doesn't seem as good as what Mom and Dad described, or I wonder what this thing is all about. Let me go talk to somebody about it.
This gentleman. Wait. Let's come.
My name is Alan Altman. I'm a gynecologist. I'm a sexual medicine specialist. I've read your stuff, Marty. We've actually spoken at meetings. What I'd like to ask you to address is the fact that our culture has evolved very nicely and very in an advanced way, where men and women are more or less equal.
In some ways,
This doesn't work in the bedroom all the time.
right?
Being equal doesn't mean they're the same. There is still that yin and yang necessary, or for many people, in the bedroom. A lot of patients that I see look to porn to regain looking at that yin and yang. Somebody being more powerful, some being more submissive. Would you comment on that with respect to relationships of couples that you see?
Sure, sure. And if you're a gynecologist, hopefully you're one of the few gynecologists who actually talks about sex rather than vaginas. You're asking a really, and vulvas. You're asking an important question. Here's a fact about human sexuality. All human sexual interaction involves power dynamics. And that's not a good thing and it's not a bad thing. It's just the way it is. All relationships involve power dynamics. And by power dynamics, I don't mean one person being more powerful than the other, one person being more privileged than the other, one person having more options than the other. That's not what I mean. What I mean is that human interactions involve power dynamics where people want stuff from each other. Whether what you want from somebody is a business contact or whether what you want from somebody is a warm gaze of approval. So sexual interactions involve power dynamics. And when partners feel comfortably equal with each other, they can actually manipulate those power dynamics and make the sex more exciting if that's what they want to do. Part of the problem with porn for young people is that young people don't know about this, and when they see depictions of consensual power play in porn, they don't know that what they're watching is a game. They think what they're watching is literal depiction, and that's a bad idea to acquire. So you're right that one of the ways that couples want to spice up their sexual experiences is by emphasizing or focusing on some of the power dynamics. And one of the ways you can see people doing that is by looking at porn. It's absolutely vital that the people in the couple talk to each other about what they're trying to accomplish by doing this, and that everybody feels comfortable with what's going on, and that nobody feels either disrespected or a sense of too much responsibility to make this game work.
I'm afraid, I'm sorry, we have run out of time. You got to go solve Syria. Marty Klein, thank you so much. I really appreciate this. Thank you all for coming and participating.